Good morning. We look today at Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 30. And in Matthew chapter 13, as other places, Jesus teaches in parables. And a parable is a story that, I don't like to say they're like Aesop's fables, but they're a story that Jesus uses. And how many times in our lives have we had parents or, other people use a story that maybe based somewhat on fact, but it's just like this. The first parable is the parable of the sower. And well, maybe Jesus saw a person standing there, casting seed out, and this came to him, but I read, you read different books, you hear different songs. And how does somebody come up with a new song, a new melody, a new, this is the way their mind works. But Jesus uses stories, and stories are a good way to get a point across. And I know from past experiences that, an awful lot of people in churches really enjoy the children's sermon because it's a story taught at a younger, at an easier to understand level. And that's why, sometimes the pastors get caught up in using big words and fancy terminology, and you're speaking over the heads of everybody, and that doesn't work. So Jesus uses stories, and we need to remember that they're stories. That in the story, this isn't the story of the prodigal son here, but there's people that say, well, what if the son has an ulterior motive to come back and get more? Well, Jesus is telling each story for a point. And we can examine things from different areas and think about things that go on in our lives, and that's fine. But to remember that Jesus is telling the stories to people that are under the rule of a foreign government, that they are, mostly not very wealthy, and that most of them haven't really heard good news about God. Rather that, it's, you need to pay your debts, you need to offer your sacrifices, and nothing you're doing is good enough. And they didn't know about God's grace, the true grace of God, the forgiveness that comes. And so Jesus is using these stories and to make a point. And this first story, the parable that he uses is the parable of the sower. And, it says, starts out that same day. So this is all happening on one day, the same as when Jesus' mother and brothers, came to look for him, and he had healed people and was teaching people. And when he got into a boat and sat down so that he could, be a little bit of a distance from people, that he could see him better, or maybe, and to hear him better. And he tells them the story of the sower and how, some seed falls on the path, some on the rocky ground, some in the thorny ground, and some on good ground. And what happens with each of the four seeds? Some of it gets eaten by birds right away. Some of it takes root, is a shallow root, and dies right away. Some takes root and is choked out by the thorns, and some grows and yields abundantly. And after they get, and then he says, listen. I love that word, listen, and we're not very good at that sometimes. We hear something, but not everything that's going on, and I did that just the other day, but we need to make sure that we hear, rather than, my response to Cheryl the other night was, what are you, because I didn't hear part of what she said, and regardless, but Jesus says, listen. And the disciples then ask him, well, what does this parable mean? And Jesus explains the parable, and you guys and gals have all heard this parable preached many, many times, and the meaning of the parable. And And, just not so long ago at worship on Sunday, we sang, Lord, let my heart be good soil. And it is. I mean, we want our hearts, we want ourselves to be good soil. We want to be productive, not only in our life of faith, well, hopefully we want to be productive in our life of faith, but in our life as a general rule. We want to be a productive citizen. We want to provide a living for ourselves and our family, and to provide a home, and we want to do those things, to be productive. So we want to be that that good soil. And he says Jesus says, for those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But for those who have nothing, even that will be taken away. And Jesus tells them the reason that I speak in parables is, kind of fulfilling some prophecy in the Old Testament. He talks about what Isaiah had said, in verses, 14 and 15. He quotes from Isaiah. And this is just another reminder for us that even though Jesus didn't study the scriptures under, some Pharisee or some great teacher, he knew what the scriptures were. And that's when he, at a point when he gets up to read, he opens the scroll to this point. I mean, it wasn't handed to him that way. He opened the scroll, is what the Bible tells us. And but he says in verse 16, blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. And, it's a reminder for us that those of us that know God are blessed. Those of us that hear the word of God's grace and God's love and God's forgiveness are, we're blessed, And then verse 17, he says, truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but didn't. And they longed to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. And he's referring to seeing him, the Messiah, come into the world. People have been watching and waiting for the Messiah, for generations. And Jesus says, many of the past generations have waited and watched and haven't been fortunate enough, but you see. And so then finding out, starting in verse 18, he explains the parable of the sower to the disciples. And sometimes in our lectionary, as we read this, we might skip some of those verses in between so we hear both parts of the parable, or sometimes we may just hear, the parable itself, and then it's, we come to the explanation and to the understanding of it. And then in verse 24, the last 7 verses we look at today, he uses another illustration of a sower, a farmer who goes and he plants good seed, but he says the enemy came and planted weeds, and they grew up, and this is a text that, out in our rural part of North Dakota, we mainly understand. We understand how, wild oats and wheat, as they first germinate, don't look much different in the field until the heads come. And then, if you go out and you pull the wild oats by hand, you're going to kill a lot of the wheat as well. Or, pigeon grass, when it first comes up, other than that it's not in the row, doesn't look a lot different. But then it changes, and you can see the color of the roots, or the base of the plant, not the roots, is different. So you can distinguish it that way. But Jesus said, that there is God seeds good, but the devil is working around, and he's sowing evil seeds and evil thoughts, and it's one way that Jesus is saying that, on this earth, God is letting good and evil exist together. Because there are so many people that say, well, if there is a God, why does he allow this? Well, you look at this parable that Jesus talks about right here, where, the farmer sowed good seeds, but someone came and put the weed seeds in there. And Jesus says, at the time, at the harvest, then we're going to be able to tell the difference. In our modern farming today, with all of the chemicals that we have, We can spray something on our wheat to kill wild oats. I mean, and to kill pigeon grass, and to take some of those weeds out. But regardless is that in our fields there are weeds, and there are things that are going to grow that aren't wanted. And a corn plant in a wheat field is a weed. A sunflower in a wheat field is a weed. Wheat in a cornfield is a it's not supposed to be there. It's a weed. So the same plant can be good or bad, depending on where it is. But it's to know that God is in the world, and that God knows that there is good and evil, and for us to do our best to live a life that reflects God is what God would have us do, to be that good soil that we hope we are.